Hi everyone, welcome back to Teal Talks. And if this is your first video that you're watching with us, welcome. This is our social media series where Chris and I are our regular hosts and we will be joined with guests. And this week we are joined by our two guests, but I will allow everyone to do an introduction in a second. So this is going to be our second video in kind of a mini series within a series that we were doing around kind of the impacts of social media today and how it is connected to sexual violence in our work with survivors. So today we wanted to talk about sexualization in the media. But before we get into that conversation, I wanted us to go around and do some introductions. So my name is Holly. I am one of the counselors/advocates in the SARC Lebanon office, and I will let everyone also introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Chris. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also a counselor/advocate at SARC in Lebanon.
Hello, my name is Katie. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the prevention and outreach specialist for SARC Lebanon.
Hi everyone, my name is Tyler. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am the Master of Social Work intern at SARC for 2021.
So as Holly mentioned, we wanted to talk a little bit about sexualization in the media and some of the things that kind of go along with that. So one of the things that I think is really important to talk about is some of the impacts of sexualization in the media. And a lot of times when we have this conversation, it's largely around the sexualization of women and girls, but it's a very binary perspective and we kind of leave out a lot of people. So we leave out a lot of different gender identities and sexual orientations, and that can be really damaging. But regardless, there are a lot of mental health impacts for all genders and all identities when it comes to things such as low self-esteem, eating disorders, depression, so on and so forth.
And so I think we've all been there on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube or TikTok or wherever you're at, and you're scrolling or looking at a video or seeing an advertisement, it could be even on TV as well. And you're just like, what is going on? Like, what is this? Why is this on my feed? And you have those moments where you're like, what about my body? Like, what does my body look like compared to that? And so you have those moments and it can be really triggering and stressful for a lot of people.
Definitely. And something that I think also comes up often with sexualization in the media is age appropriateness. I think I often think about shows like Toddlers and Tiaras or Dance Moms when we see, particularly as we're talking about the binary, young girls dancing, or if we look at TikTok where we're seeing children oftentimes engaged in these short videos where it's determined that these scenes and videos are sexualized. And I do quotes because I think that there's a lot of dialogue online as to, is this sexual or are you making it sexual? Just because a child is dancing, does it make that dance sexualized? Or is it dancing that you are now sexualizing and you are now sexualizing the child? And I think that when we think about sexualization in general and the portrayal of adults and the portrayal of children and the media as a whole, I think that that's also really, really important. Who does the sexualization? How are we interpreting the media that we consume? And just as Tyler and Chris brings up, how is this impacting the viewer and the person that's consuming this media? Because it has long-term impacts on adults, on our children, on our teens, and on our body image and the way in which we relate to our bodies and ourselves.
Absolutely. And I appreciate so much, Holly, you bringing up the idea that the way we talk about people online or the images of them that we allow give us permission to sexualize people without their consent. The way we choose to sexualize people also has a flip side of sometimes denying people the right to be seen as sexual beings in their own right. I think about something I've heard many times about dating apps, that Black women and Asian men get the least responses of anybody when it comes to seeking out people on dating apps. And that's a direct product of who the media tells us is worth being attracted to or not. So just as much as telling people it's fine to be attracted to minors can have negative impacts, so can never showing anybody the sexual agency and sexual worth of people who might not be white, people who might not be cisgender. All of these different silences and exclusions can also deny people the agency they deserve.
And I think Katie makes a really good point, even about the stereotypes that are perpetuated in those spaces, how they are shown, how they are depicted, and then how we kind of perpetuate them or mimic them in our own lives, or how we see them in our own lives. And some of those are super problematic. The example Katie just gave is a good example of that, how we see these things in the media, on social media, on TV, in movies, and then they kind of transcend into our lives or into the lives of people we know. And how that creates some really big disparities, exclusions, and harmful impacts for people. So I think that's really important. And by the way, I just realized that I end a lot of my sentences as if I'm not ending a sentence. And Tyler, I did it to you earlier, where you looks like you weren't sure if I was finished because the inflection of my voice. So I'm gonna work on that so people know when I'm done talking. I just felt like I had to address that. So I apologize for the weird space in between and after my commentary.
Thank
You
you.
could just start saying period.
Yes, period.
It's all good. And I think, Chris, you you alluded to something earlier on in the video about how these sexualizations in medias are usually really polarizing and binary. And we're still, to this day, unfortunately, in my opinion, hyper masculinizing and hyper feminizing women and men into these two categories. And it creates unrealistic expectations that all men are supposed to have six-pack abs and muscles and work out 3 times a day and only eat kale and steak, and, as someone who's male identifying, like, it's unrealistic. It's just unrealistic. And I know that the same goes for women as well, because the hyperfeminism and that sexualization, it's also unattainable and unrealistic for a lot of people. And then where does that leave people who are non-binary or who are trans? And having to try to fit those molds is difficult and pretty much impossible for a lot of people. So that can be really, really hard, especially for our LGBTQ folks.
And as Katie was saying, and just as you were saying as well, Tyler, when we're missing out and people are not represented at all in the media. And when we think about sexualization, I always will go back to survivors. So when we look at individuals who are not represented and sexually are kind of excluded from the conversation, if we're thinking about physical ability, sexual orientation, gender orientation, race, ethnicity, these people who are maybe assumed to not have any sexual it would make sense that that person now is not going to be believed or may not feel comfortable coming forward, because if they've been excluded from this conversation, if they've been excluded from this narrative within the media of sex in general, then if this sexual violence were to occur to them, or these negative sexual experiences were to occur to them, I'm sure it can feel as though there isn't a space for that conversation to occur or this belief to occur. And that does happen. This belief is not always there. And that makes the conversation very, very difficult, and that experience much more difficult for survivors.
Yeah, and like think about movies and shows and how they use sex and sexual assault as story arcs, or even transphobia or racism as story arcs. Let's make this character, interesting. Let's give a sexual assault scene. Like, no, that's not okay to do that, especially when in these shows and movies, sometimes those people are children. That could be really, really triggering and really, really damaging. And it's not okay. It's not okay to normalize that.
And Tyler, you just made me think of even too, and how often when there is this sexual storyline or backstory, it's often like a cisgender woman who is dressed in a short skirt and tight clothing and revealing clothing. And I think it creates a lot of victim blaming narratives and perpetuates a lot of stereotypes about sexual violence that we know not to be true. So it doesn't just happen to cisgender women, it happens to everybody. And it, I think, just perpetuates again that idea that like that short skirt and the tight shirt and all of these other things that really aren't accurate. And I think as a survivor, not seeing that representation even in the media of like, this is totally an inaccurate and such a far stretch from my experiences of trauma can really create a lot of challenges for survivors too, and be very triggering.
In some ways, sexualization can almost give permission to victimize some groups of people more than others. A common statistic I really think about, we know that 1 in 3 women generally will experience some form of sexual violence in their life, and that is a high number. But when we isolate that by sexual orientation, we see it jumps to 75% of bisexual women. We can think about reasons for that. This will date me to the T, but I was in high school when that Katy Perry I Kissed a Girl song came out. And I know exactly what happened to the way everybody in my school talked about bisexual people. Bisexual women were, to use their language, slutty, easy, seeking attention, promiscuous, didn't have boundaries. And if that's what I believe about a person, how inclined am I to ask for consent? Or if something does happen to that person, how likely are they to be believed coming forward, believed by a jury of their peers? So the way we sexualize people can sometimes deny them the ability to be seen as sexual human beings at all. Like Holly gave us the great example of individuals who may have disabilities. It can also make people seem only like sexual objects, like it might to many LGBT people. It's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because the person being sexualized ultimately is in control of the way other people see them. I said isn't, right? Because isn't are really big differences in that sentence.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that these are all really good things to be aware of. Like Katie mentioned with that example, which I think is something I hadn't even thought about, like this kind of extends beyond just like visual depictions of sexualization. It can also be portrayed in music and in other things that we receive and that we see and that we hear. So it could be in a podcast, it could be in a song. So there's different ways that we get this information. And I think that that's really important just to point out because they do influence us. And there's ways in which I think some of those things get left out of the conversation. So really what we can do is be super aware of these things. And again, like disrupt those narratives and make sure that we're having conversations that are inclusive. And for people in the filmmaking industry, for things like that, make sure we're being inclusive in the depictions of people and of different gender identities, sexual orientations, abilities, race, ethnicity, etc. Making sure that we're really being representative, I think, is important. So it's a really broad topic that I think we could probably spend forever talking about, but hopefully everyone walks away from this video with a little bit more information about sexualization in the media, some of the negative impacts of it, and some of the ways in which it perpetuates harmful stereotypes and harmful beliefs and ideas, especially about sexual violence and about survivors, but also just about people in general and how that may impact somebody's mental health, their self-esteem, their thoughts and feelings about their body and where they fit in and the boxes that they might not fit into. So this was a really important conversation and I'm so glad you were all able to join us. Katie, Tyler, thank you both for being our special guests for the last 2 videos. We really appreciate you and hope to have you back in future videos. So again, thank you all for watching, and I'm gonna steal Holly's thunder and say if you have any comments, drop them in the comments section. We would love to hear from you, have an ongoing dialogue about some of these things. If you have anything further that you would want us to talk about too, drop those there as well. We will definitely incorporate that into future videos. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you in future videos. Well, you seeing us, I guess we don't see you, but you get the gist.
Everyone.
Bye.